A year ago, when I ranked the sitcoms loved by viewers and hated by critics, there was never any doubt about number one, Mrs. Brown's Boys. It was the show that seemed to sum up the whole argument in a single title. Critics have spent more than a decade treating it like the death of comedy itself, but millions of viewers still turned it into a Christmas institution. I won't be repeating the original analysis. We now have something far more compelling to review. We are witnessing a sitcom's endgame. The metrics have shifted, the cultural landscape has evolved, and the question is no longer how this show became a juggernaut, but how it managed to survive and what its decline tells us about the state of modern television. Mrs. Brown's Boys is not just another unpopular-with-critics sitcom. It is probably the clearest modern example of a show becoming a cultural battleground, a comfort blanket to one audience, a national embarrassment to another. It's somehow both things at once. Before we get to the fourth wall breaks, the Christmas ratings collapse, or the arguments over whether the BBC is keeping it alive out of loyalty, inertia or genuine demand, I want to go back to the version of Agnes Brown that a lot of people have forgotten even existed, because the BBC sitcom wasn't the beginning of the story. One reason Mrs. Brown's Boys is so fascinating is that people often talk about it as if it arrived fully formed on BBC One. The wig, the swearing, the corpsing, the studio audience, the endless Christmas specials. The Agnes Brown transmitted into millions of homes by BBC Scotland in 2011 wasn't a pristine, original creation. She was the end product of a 20-year theatrical mutation. The character goes back to a 1992 radio play by Brendan O'Carroll on RTE2 FM. That spawned a run of books, starting with The Mammy, that placed Agnes in a much tougher, more recognisably working-class Dublin world. Then there was the 1999 film Agnes Brown, directed and starring Angelica Houston. Based on The Mammy, that version keeps the bones of the story, a widowed mother, 7 children, financial pressure and resilience through humour. The tone was warm and funny, yet it was also tender, melancholy and rooted in a believable social world. In that earlier version, Agnes wasn't a TV catchphrase machine. She was a widow trying to hold a family together in a world of money worries, grief and sheer survival. Mrs. Brown then transitioned through family stage shows, straight to DVD productions and eventually to the television sitcom developed with BBC Scotland and launched on RTE1 and BBC One. By the time the format was regularised for television, the sharp edges of Dublin North Side hardship had been thoroughly filed down, replaced by the formula of broad, end-of-the-pier pantomime. It didn't just stumble into lowbrow chaos, it was systematically re-engineered for it. The story started with a much sadder, rougher Agnes. Underneath all the mugging and the mayhem, there was still the faint outline of a real working-class mammy holding the family together. If the origin story explains where Agnes came from, the format explains why Mrs. Brown's Boys became such a cultural fault line. On paper, the production violates every fundamental discipline of studio comedy. It actively weaponises what any traditional director would categorise as a technical error, corpsing, addressing the camera, dropping lines and exposing the literal physical boundaries of the set. Where classical sitcom craftsmanship relies on sustaining a narrative illusion, O'Carroll's format deliberately dismantles the machinery in front of the viewer, and that, I think, is the key to the whole thing. Fans do not experience those moments as mistakes in the usual sense. They experience them as proof that something is alive and happening. The laughs feel less manufactured because the cast sometimes seem to be enjoying themselves as much as the audience. That is why the show often plays less like a polished television sitcom and more like a touring family panto that just happens to have cameras present. The audience is not being asked to forget the artifice. They are being invited in on it. But that exact same format also explains the hatred, because if you want a sitcom to build a world, sustain an illusion and hide the wiring, Mrs. Brown's Boys can feel almost aggressively careless. Critics have spent years calling it end of the pier junk, relic television and a stage farce accidentally left on BBC One. And that is the dividing line you have to understand before anything else. Mrs. Brown's Boys is not failing to be a conventional sitcom, it is refusing to be one. And that refusal is either the source of its charm or the reason people think it represents the death of comedy. People did not keep coming back to Mrs. Brown's Boys for more than a decade just because someone looked at the camera and swore. They came back because the chaos comes with the unusually lived-in feel of the family dynamic. That is partly because Brendan O'Carroll built the show around his own relatives, with Jennifer Gibney, Danny O'Carroll, Fiona O'Carroll and Eilish O'Carroll all woven into the cast. That means the shorthand, interruptions and background reactions do not feel manufactured in the same way they might in a more conventional sitcom ensemble. And underneath all the mugging, there is another reason fans stuck with it. Agnes is not just a joke machine, Agnes is the moral centre. For all the crude innuendo and slapstick, the show almost always bends back towards a sentimental ending, a little speech, a family reconciliation, a reminder that beneath the shouting and nonsense, this is still a world built around loyalty. That's where a lot of critics rush to condemn the show, because those endings can feel unearned. For the people who love the show, that is the point. It's not meant to leave you admiring the craft, it is meant to leave you feeling reassured. In other words, Mrs. Brown's Boys does not just offer jokes, it offers emotional certainty. Family rows that heal, values that stay intact, and a mammy who, however chaotic the route, gets everyone back in line by the end. And that leads to the most combustible part of the whole conversation. The snobbery debate, because over time, liking or disliking Mrs. Brown's Boys stopped being just a question of taste and turned into a social signal. Fans were more likely to be working class and older, while detractors skewed more middle class, more male and more degree educated. That doesn't mean every fan or critic fits a stereotype, but it does help explain why the show inspired such fierce defensiveness. To many viewers, attacking Mrs. Brown's Boys did not just sound like this sitcom is bad. It sounded like the things you laugh at, the kind of comfort you want, and maybe even the class instincts you come from, are beneath contempt. And once a comedy starts carrying that kind of symbolic weight, it stops being just a comedy. It becomes a small culture war in a cardigan. And this is the point where the story changes. Up to here, you can explain the successes, the origins, the pantomime format, the family warmth, the anti-snobbery defence, but somewhere along the line, the same qualities that once made Mrs. Brown's Boys feel unruly and alive started to curdle into repetition. The biggest symbol of that shift is Rory Brown. When Rory Cowan left in 2017, the show lost one of its oldest non-family pillars, and the way the change was handled tells you almost everything you need to know about how this universe works. The character came back after plastic surgery, with Damien McKiernan revealed under the bandages in the Christmas special. It is absurd, it is brazen, it is perfectly on brand, but it also feels like a warning sign. The show is bigger than any of its component parts. One of the most common complaints in the later years is not just that the jokes are old, is that the slip-ups no longer feel real. The fundamental problem with relying on mechanical breakdown as a stylistic choice is that eventual repetition exposes the blueprint. The corpsing, the missed cues, the performative stumbles that once felt like live, unvarnished theatre now carry the distinct chill of rehearsal. It's no longer genuine spontaneity, it is the calculated simulation of spontaneity. And once an audience detects the rehearsal behind the mistake, the magic trick evaporates. By 2024, Even hostile reviews were no longer only saying the show was crude or lowbrow. The Telegraph called the 2024 Christmas special an embarrassing relic of single entendres and sickly sentimentality, while the Irish Independent said the 2025 run looked like the work of someone who's running on fumes. This is a different kind of criticism. This is not, "I hate this style." It is, even the style is no longer generating enough energy to disguise the repetition. Earlier on, the cheapness and visible rough edges could be read as part of the charm, a studio show that knew it was basically a televised panto. Later, for some viewers, those same qualities stop feeling charming and start feeling second-hand. The sets look thinner, the rhythm slower, the chaos increasingly organised. Even the BBC's scheduling tells you part of the story. The 2025 series launch returned with only 1.5 million overnight viewers, reigniting the sense that this was no longer a juggernaut but an institution in managed decline. So, this is really the midpoint of the whole story, the moment when a format built on getting away with murder starts to look like it is getting away with the same trick one too many times. At some point though, every argument about taste runs into arithmetic, and the arithmetic on Mrs. Brown's Boys is brutal. In 2013, the Christmas special, Bucking Mammy, pulled in 11.52 million viewers, the kind of figure that turns a divisive sitcom into a genuine national event. A decade later, the 2024 Christmas special was down to just 2.2 million overnight viewers, low enough to make the decline impossible to spin away as just critic snobbery or social media pile-on. This is where you do have to be fair, because the people defending the show are not completely wrong. Overnight viewing is not the whole story anymore, especially for an older BBC brand that still gets watched on demand. The 2024 Christmas special rose from 2.2 million overnight to 3.88 million across 7 days, enough to make it one of the 10 most watched British TV comedies of the year. That does not erase the collapse. Going from more than 11 million to under 4 is still a collapse, but it does change the texture of it. The audience has not vanished, it has shrunk, aged, fragmented and drifted from appointment viewing into catch-up. And then, just when the ratings seem to tell a clean story of terminal decline, the awards muddy the water again. In 2024, Mrs. Brown's Boys won the Comedy Prize at the National Television Awards, a public voted result that enraged detractors and delighted its defenders. That contradiction is exactly why this show is such a perfect case study. The numbers say the era of total domination is over, but the vote says there's still a real audience willing not to just watch it, but to actively back it against more critically fashionable rivals. This is the clearest version of the paradox. The giant has undeniably shrunk, but it's still large enough to keep embarrassing the people who thought the country had moved on. And this is where the story stops being just a debate about taste and starts becoming a debate about timing. In October 2024, Brendan O'Carroll apologised after an offensive remark at rehearsals triggered a BBC investigation and briefly paused production on the Christmas special. I'm not dwelling on the wording itself because the important point is bigger than the individual incident. For years, the central argument around Mrs. Brown's Boys was that it was crude, old-fashioned and critic-proof. After 2024, the criticism shifted. The question was no longer just whether the show was lowbrow. It was whether it now looked culturally out of time in a way the BBC could no longer casually shrug off. That matters because by this point the show is also running on something more powerful than audience enthusiasm: institutional momentum. In 2020, Brendan O'Carroll confirmed a BBC deal that runs through 2026 and includes a clause guaranteeing the Christmas Day 10 p.m. slot for any festive special he makes. That turns the endgame into a fascinating little industry story. Is Mrs. Brown's Boys still on because the public keeps demanding it? Because catch-up numbers make it viable? Or because once a show becomes part of the Christmas furniture, It's genuinely hard for a broadcaster to admit the room might look better without it. And that's why 2026 matters so much, because for the first time in years there is at least the possibility of a genuine decision point. Late in 2025, Brendan O'Carroll said he would keep going for as long as the BBC wanted him and would be open to signing one-year extensions beyond the current deal. So the real question is not whether he wants to stop, it's whether the BBC and the audience want to stop with him. And that widens the scope of the story one last time. By the end of this story, Mrs. Brown's Boys is no longer just a sitcom people argue about, it's a test case for whether British television still has room for this kind of old school studio panto, or whether we're now simply watching the contractual afterlife of a format whose moment has already passed. But here's the thing, Mrs. Brown's Boys was never just a bad sitcom people complained about. If it were, it would have disappeared years ago. It lasted because it gave a big audience something they were not getting from more fashionable comedy. Noise, warmth, chaos, sentiment, and a mammy who could hold the whole house together with a glare and a swear word. The critics never really killed it. Time did, or at least time got close. So now we are left with one final question. Will we see Mrs. Brown this Christmas? And if we do, will it be the very last time she and her offspring gather round that collapsing Christmas tree on the BBC? But what do you think? Is it time for the BBC to move on, or is there still life left in the old format? Let me know in the comments.